Imagine growing up without the internet, no smartphones, no social media, no constant notifications telling you what to think, how to feel, or who to be. You played outside until the streetlights turned on. You drank water from a garden hose. You learned independence early, sometimes because you had to. Faith for many families was practiced quietly and consistently. Church on Sunday wasn't a performance, it was routine. Prayer wasn't posted online, it was personal. Belief wasn't debated constantly. It was lived out in everyday habits. Now imagine being raised in that quiet offline world, and then living as a Christian in a culture shaped by screens and constant digital pressure. In this video, we explore the psychology of Gen X Christians, believers born between 1965 and 1980, and examine why they believe the way they do. Generation X was born between 1965 and 1980. They are often called the forgotten generation. Not as idealistic as the boomers, not as digitally native as millennials, not as hyper-online as Gen Z. Psychologists describe Gen X as independent, skeptical, resilient, and realistic. And when it comes to faith, those traits show up clearly. Here's something important about Gen X Christians. They don't follow blindly. Many of them grew up during cultural shifts, rising divorce rates, economic instability, political distrust, scandals, and institutions. They learned early not to automatically trust authority, including religious authority. This doesn't mean they rejected faith, it means they questioned it. Gen X Christians often went through a phase of asking hard questions. Is this real? Is this authentic? Is this just tradition? Does this actually make sense? Their faith, if they kept it, became deeply personal. Not inherited, but examined. Unlike older generations who often practiced faith because that's just what we do, Gen X Christians tend to practice faith because they decided to. Psychologically, this creates a different kind of belief. Research on generational identity shows that Gen X values authenticity over performance. They are not impressed by loud displays. They are not easily moved by hype. They want substance. In church settings, this often means they prefer sermons that are practical and honest. They are less interested in emotional manipulation and more interested in clarity. They want faith that works in real life, in careers, in parenting, in marriage, in financial pressure, not just on Sunday. Here's something fascinating. Gen X grew up at a time when people were encouraged to think for themselves, question tradition, and make their own decisions about what to believe. This shaped their spirituality. Gen X Christians tend to be less focused on religious identity as a public label and more focused on private responsibility. They don't always talk about their faith constantly. They don't always post verses online. They don't always join every church program. But they take personal accountability seriously. Psychologists often describe Gen X as self-reliant. That same trait appears in their faith life. They read, they think, they reflect. They process internally, sometimes quietly. Another strong psychological pattern in Gen X Christians is realism. They tend to see the world as it is, not as they wish it were. They are not naive about the world. They lived through economic recessions, they saw institutions fail, they watched public scandals unfold. So when they approach Christianity, they often do so with open eyes. They know churches are imperfect, they know leaders can fail, they know communities can disappoint, and yet, many still stay, not because they think Christianity is flawless, but because they separate faith in God from faith in human systems. That distinction is psychologically significant. Gen X is also known as the latchkey generation. Many came home from school to empty houses. They learned independence early. This independence created emotional resilience. And in Christianity, this often translates into steady, durable belief rather than dramatic emotional swings. Gen X Christians may not always be the loudest worshipers, but they are often the ones who stay consistent. Consistency over intensity. That's a strong psychological marker. Here's another layer. Gen X became parents during the explosion of technology. They are the bridge generation, old enough to remember analog life, young enough to adapt to digital life. This creates tension. Many Gen X Christians feel responsible for protecting their children from a culture that feels louder, faster, and more confusing than the one they grew up in. Psychologically, this creates a protective form of faith. They are not just thinking about their own spirituality, they are thinking about legacy. How do I pass on belief in a world where faith is constantly challenged? This question weighs heavily on many Gen X Christian parents. Now here's something many people overlook. Gen X values privacy deeply. Unlike younger generations who grew up sharing everything publicly, Gen X often separates public life and personal life. This affects how they practice Christianity. They may not post about every prayer, they may not broadcast every spiritual insight, they may not debate theology online. But that does not mean they lack conviction. In fact, their faith is often guarded, not displayed. Psychologically, this reflects a generation that learned early to rely on internal stability rather than external validation. There is also a quiet fatigue many Gen X Christians experience. They are often caring for aging parents, supporting children, managing careers, handling financial pressure. They are the middle layer. And this stage of life shapes spiritual needs. Gen X Christians often look for faith that provides endurance, not excitement, strength, not spectacle, wisdom, not trends. They are less interested in reinventing Christianity and more interested in sustaining it. Many Gen X Christians were also influenced by the tone of Christian leadership they encountered while growing up. During their formative years, public faith was often represented by steady, long-term voices, figures like Billy Graham, who emphasized consistency, moral clarity, and disciplined conviction. The message was not built around constant reinvention or spectacle, but around commitment over time. For a generation that values realism and endurance, that example reinforced something important. Faith is not about chasing emotional highs or cultural approval. It is about staying grounded through changing seasons. That model of belief, steady, serious, and sustained, still resonates with many Gen X Christians today. So what is the psychology of Gen X Christians? Independent but faithful, skeptical but committed, private but principled, realistic but hopeful. They are not easily impressed, but once convinced, they are steady. They may not dominate headlines, they may not define trends, they may not shout the loudest, but they endure. And in many ways, endurance is one of the strongest psychological traits a believer can have. If this video helped you understand this generation better, or maybe you recognized yourself in it, give it a like. Personality, culture, and generation shape how faith is lived, not whether it is real. And sometimes the most stable believers are the ones who don't need attention to stay committed. If you're a Gen X Christian, or you know someone who is, comment below. It would be interesting to hear your perspective. And subscribe for more content exploring the psychology behind Christian faith and different generations.